He was 15 years old, no criminal record, no military training, no access badge, and yet, he broke into NASA, he broke into the US Department of Defense. And he did it from his bedroom. In the late 1990s, while most teenagers were playing video games or figuring out algebra homework, one boy quietly crossed digital borders that were supposed to be impenetrable. His online name was C0MRAID, and within months, that name would appear in internal FBI reports, Pentagon briefings, and national security investigations. This wasn't a movie plot, this wasn't fiction, this was real. When federal agents finally realized what had happened, the damage was already done. Critical systems had been accessed, sensitive software had been copied, military networks had been compromised, and the most disturbing part, the hacker wasn't hiding in a foreign country. He wasn't backed by an intelligence agency, he wasn't even legally old enough to drive. His real name was Jonathan James. Over the next few years, his story would become a warning about the power of the internet, the fragility of digital security, and the cost of putting a teenage mind under the full weight of federal pressure. This is the true story of Jonathan James, the first juvenile hacker sent to prison in the United States. A boy who breached the most powerful institutions on Earth and paid a price that few ever talk about. This is C0MRAID. Jonathan Joseph James was born in 1983 in Miami, Florida. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about him. No signs of a future criminal mastermind, no obvious red flags. His parents divorced when he was young, and Jonathan grew up mostly with his mother. Like many kids of the 1990s, he spent a lot of time alone. And that isolation would quietly shape everything that came next. Jonathan wasn't particularly interested in school. He struggled with structure, authority, and rules that felt arbitrary. But there was one thing that instantly captured his attention: computers. In the late 1990s, the internet was still a wild frontier. Security was weak, the documentation was scarce, and curiosity often mattered more than credentials. Jonathan taught himself how systems worked, not from textbooks, but from experimentation, trial and error, breaking things, fixing them again. He learned operating systems, network protocols, remote access tools, and he learned something else just as important: how often adults had no idea what their own systems were doing. Online, Jonathan wasn't just a teenager, he was C0MRAID. In underground forums and IRC channels, usernames mattered more than age. Skill mattered more than diplomas, and C0MRAID quickly earned a reputation, not for vandalism, not for chaos, but for curiosity. Jonathan later said he wasn't interested in destroying systems or stealing money. He wanted to understand how things worked, and how they could fail. But curiosity has a dangerous edge, because once you realize a door is unlocked, it becomes very hard not to see what's on the other side. By the time Jonathan was 15 years old, he wasn't just exploring random servers anymore. He was drifting toward targets that were never meant to be touched. Targets protected by the most powerful government on Earth, and soon, one name would stand out above all others: NASA. In 1999, NASA was not just a space agency. It was a symbol of technological supremacy, of American innovation, and like many government institutions at the time, its digital defenses were far weaker than its public image suggested. Jonathan James didn't start with NASA. He moved slowly, testing smaller systems, learning how administrators configured their networks, looking for patterns, looking for mistakes. And eventually, he found one. A vulnerable server belonging to NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. No alarms, no intrusion detection that stopped him, just an open door. Once inside, Jonathan didn't smash anything. He explored, he escalated privileges, he mapped internal systems. He quietly copied files to understand what kind of access he truly had, and what he found was staggering. Jonathan gained access to software used to control the International Space Station. Code responsible for managing life support systems, temperature regulation, and physical environment controls. This wasn't theoretical, this wasn't harmless data. According to investigators, NASA later had to shut down large parts of its network for weeks. The agency estimated damages in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, not because systems were destroyed, but because everything had to be audited, rebuilt, and secured. For Jonathan, the moment was surreal. He later said he didn't fully understand the scale of what he had accessed. To him, it was code files, systems behaving exactly as they were designed to, but to NASA, this was a nightmare. A 15-year-old had reached systems tied to human life in orbit. And worse, no one noticed until after the fact. Internally, panic spread. Questions followed: how was this possible? Who was responsible? And most importantly, how many other doors were just as unlocked? NASA contacted federal authorities, logs were analyzed, IP addresses traced. And slowly, the investigation moved away from foreign adversaries and toward something no one expected. The source of the intrusion wasn't overseas, it wasn't a rival nation. It was a teenager living in Florida. And this was only the beginning. Because while NASA was still trying to understand the breach, Jonathan James was already moving on. His next target would be even more sensitive: the U.S. Department of Defense. By late 1999, Jonathan James had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Hacking NASA was one thing, but what came next pushed his actions into a completely different category. Jonathan began probing networks connected to the U.S. Department of Defense. These weren't public-facing systems, they weren't academic servers. They were military networks, designed to be isolated, controlled, and protected. And yet, just like before, Jonathan found weaknesses. Misconfigured systems, outdated software, trust relationships that assumed no one would ever look too closely. Using techniques he had refined over months, Jonathan gained access to Defense Department computers. And once again, he didn't destroy anything. He observed, he copied files, he explored internal directories. At one point, he accessed emails and user accounts belonging to military personnel. This was no longer just a security embarrassment. This was a national security incident. Federal investigators later stated that Jonathan stole software valued at over $1 million, including tools used by the Department of Defense. The implications were severe. If this software had fallen into hostile hands, the consequences could have extended far beyond embarrassment. For the Pentagon, the question was no longer how this happened. It was how fast can we stop it? The FBI escalated the case. This was no longer treated as a juvenile experimenting online. This was treated as a serious federal crime. Agents traced connections, monitored traffic, matched timestamps and logs across multiple agencies. And eventually, all paths led to the same place, a modest home in Florida. When federal agents arrived, they didn't find a hardened criminal, they found a teenager. A kid with computers, cables, and curiosity that had gone far beyond anyone's control. Jonathan was arrested in 2000. He was just 16 years old. In court, the government made its position clear. Age would not protect you, skill would not excuse you, and curiosity would not be accepted as a defense. Jonathan James became the first juvenile in U.S. history to be incarcerated for hacking crimes, but the punishment was only the beginning. Because after the courtrooms emptied, the real pressure started. And it would follow Jonathan for the rest of his life. After the headlines faded, Jonathan James tried to disappear. There were no more hacking forums. No more late-night probing networks. No more online aliases. By court order, he was banned from using computers and the internet. For a teenager whose entire world revolved around technology, this wasn't just punishment. It was exile. Jonathan served his sentence and was released, but freedom came with conditions. Strict probation, constant monitoring, and the unspoken assumption that he was never truly innocent again. Employers didn't see a teenager who made mistakes. They saw a liability. Friends drifted away. Trust was hard to earn and easy to lose. And then there was the FBI. Years after his release, whenever a major cyber incident made the news, Jonathan's name resurfaced behind the scenes. He was questioned, interviewed, asked where he was, what he was doing, who he had spoken to. Even when there was no evidence, suspicion followed him like a shadow. Jonathan later described living in a permanent state of anxiety. Always waiting for the knock at the door, always feeling watched. In 2007 and 2008, several high-profile cyber attacks targeted U.S. institutions. One of them involved breaches connected to NASA again. Jonathan was questioned. Once more, he denied any involvement. Investigators found no proof linking him to the attacks. But for Jonathan, the damage was already done. He felt trapped by a reputation he could never escape. A label that followed him everywhere: hacker, criminal, threat. In his final writings, Jonathan expressed a belief that he would never be allowed to live a normal life. That no matter what he did, he would always be seen as guilty first, and human second. The pressure mounted. And on May 18, 2008, Jonathan James reached a breaking point. What happened next would permanently change how his story was remembered. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James took his own life. He was 24 years old. In the note he left behind, Jonathan maintained his innocence regarding the recent cybercrime investigations. He wrote that he had done nothing wrong, and that he believed he would never escape suspicion. He described a life lived under a microscope, a future that felt permanently closed, and a system that, in his words, had already decided who he was regardless of what he did next. Jonathan James became a footnote in headlines, a tragic ending to a sensational story. But his case left behind uncomfortable questions. How does society deal with young offenders whose crimes are non-violent, but unprecedented? How much responsibility does a teenager truly carry in a digital world built by adults? Jonathan never profited from his hacks. He never sold secrets. He never worked for a foreign power. Yet the punishment followed him for life. His story forced governments to confront a reality they weren't ready for. That digital security was fragile, that age was no barrier to capability, and that curiosity, when combined with access, could shake institutions. Today, cybersecurity looks very different, but bounty programs exist. Ethical hacking is a profession. Young talent is recruited, not imprisoned. But those changes came after cases like Jonathan's. He was ahead of his time, and crushed by it. Jonathan James was not a hero, but he wasn't a villain either. He was a warning about systems that weren't ready, about laws that lagged behind technology, and about the human cost of making an example out of a child. His online name was on Raid. And long after the servers were patched and the headlines forgotten, his story still asks a question we haven't fully answered. What do we do when a teenager breaks the future before the future is ready?